What would you sacrifice at 2 in the morning when the world sleeps, and the only light burning is not for yourself, but for the fragile breath of someone you love? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys of hope and healing. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made the desert around Santa Fe feel like another planet. The Langford estate, with its towering adobe walls and long shadowed hallways, usually breathed with its own life during the day. Chefs preparing elaborate meals, gardeners tending to the sprawling grounds, assistants shuffling in and out like whispers of wealth. But at 2 in the morning, only one figure moved. Emily Carter sat hunched over the wide wooden table in the kitchen, her hair tied into a messy bun, her maid's uniform wrinkled from the day's labor. Before her lay nothing but scraps of brown paper torn from grocery bags. A stub of pencil sharpened down to its last gasp, and lines she had drawn, over and over, of lungs and arteries, of vessels she named silently like prayers. Her hand moved quickly, sketching the branching of pulmonary arteries, labeling the thin walls where pressure rose like a cruel tide. She whispered under her breath as though reciting scripture: right ventricle, pulmonary artery, increased pressure, right heart failure. The words steadied her. Though her chest tightened with the memory of Jacob, her little brother, only 8 years old, gasping in his sleep back in Albuquerque. His lips had turned a frightening shade of blue last week, his small body trembling as if the air had betrayed him. The doctors had given the name pulmonary arterial hypertension, PAH, a phrase that sounded more like a death sentence than a diagnosis. She had learned more from free online videos than from any doctor who brushed her aside with insurance forms. Tonight she tried again to commit to memory the delicate equation of pressure and resistance, of blood trapped in a cruel loop, unable to reach the lungs to receive oxygen. The kitchen light buzzed softly above her. She didn't hear the slow, heavy steps until the voice, deep, rough with age and authority, cut through the silence. "What exactly are you trying to save, sketching anatomy on my kitchen table at this hour?" Emily froze. The pencil slipped from her fingers. She turned and saw him, Richard Langford, the master of the house. At 62, his presence filled the doorway like a shadow carved from the earth itself. His silver hair gleamed faintly in the low light. He wore a robe loosely belted, but even in such casualness there was nothing soft about him. His eyes, cold gray like a winter sky, fixed on her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. I'm sorry, sir," Emily stammered, scrambling to gather the papers. "I'll clean this up. I didn't mean—" But Richard stepped forward, one hand raised slightly. "No, leave them." She hesitated. His gaze had landed on the rough sketches, lungs branching, arrows showing blood flow, words scrawled in hurried script. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter but edged with something sharper than reproach, he asked, "Where did you learn to draw this?" Emily swallowed hard. I've been studying. My little brother. He has pulmonary arterial hypertension." "The doctors explained almost nothing. I need to understand. It's the only way I can help him." Richard lowered himself into the chair opposite her. The movement was deliberate, the way a man of power signals that he intends to listen. He picked up one of the papers, his thumb pressing against a diagram of the right heart. "Pulmonary hypertension," he muttered. "You're telling me an 8-year-old boy has that?" Emily nodded, her eyes bright with sleepless determination. "His heart has to pump against the high pressure in the pulmonary arteries. The right ventricle, it's like forcing blood uphill all the time. Eventually it weakens. That's why he can't run without collapsing. Why his lips turn blue. Why every night I wonder if it's his last breath." Her words came out trembling but precise. She didn't know if he would understand or care. but Richard's expression shifted ever so slightly. "You speak like a student of medicine," he said slowly. "But you're just... what? A housemaid?" Emily straightened, though her hands trembled. "I am a housemaid, yes. But I read. I watch lectures online. I replay echocardiograms until I can see the chambers of the heart even when I close my eyes. If I don't learn, who will save him? The hospital already told us. Without insurance, they won't even try." The room grew heavier with silence. The desert wind rattled faintly against the kitchen window. Richard placed the paper back down and leaned back. His arms crossed. "My brother," he said suddenly, his voice gravelly, "died before he turned 30. Some heart condition no one saw coming. One moment he was alive, the next, gone. I've spent 40 years wondering if someone could have understood the signs earlier." Emily's eyes widened. She had not expected confession. The hard mask of the billionaire cracked just slightly, enough to reveal the memory lodged like a shard of glass inside him. She whispered, "Then you know what it feels like?" Richard did not answer. His gaze remained on the sketch of pulmonary arteries, but his mind seemed far away, pulled into corridors of memory. Emily leaned forward, almost pleading. "Do you see? The pressure builds here." She pointed with her finger, tracing the line she had drawn. "The blood should flow freely from the right ventricle to the lungs, but in PAH, the arteries are narrowed, stiff. It's like asking a child to breathe through a straw all day, every day. The heart keeps pushing until it can't anymore." Her voice was steady now, not timid but urgent. And Richard, to his own surprise, listened. He, who dismissed most conversations as noise, found himself unable to look away from this 19-year-old maid who explained circulation better than half the specialists he had hired for charity boards. Finally, he exhaled a long breath. "You speak with more clarity than doctors I've paid thousands to attend my galas." Emily lowered her eyes. "I just need to keep him alive." The kitchen clock ticked on. For the first time in years, Richard Langford felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar. Not pity, but recognition. He saw in Emily's determination the same relentless hunger he had once carried, though his was for empire, and hers was for a child's breath. At last, he stood, gathering the robe tighter around his frame. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice returning to its usual authority, "be careful what you chase. Knowledge can be as heavy as the illness you fight." Emily pressed her lips together, holding back tears. "Then I will carry it. For Jacob." Richard lingered one moment more, his gaze locked with hers. Then he left the kitchen, his footsteps fading into the long hallway. Emily slumped forward, her hand clutching the paper. The words she had spoken replayed in her mind, mingling with the image of Richard's unreadable face. She did not know that her midnight sketches had just opened a door to a story far larger than her small kitchen rebellion against despair. But in that moment, under the dim buzz of the old kitchen light, all she knew was this: she would not stop until Jacob could breathe freely again, even if it meant teaching herself to read the language of the heart by candlelight. The desert nights around Santa Fe had a strange way of echoing. Even within the fortified adobe walls of the Langford estate, sound seemed to carry, sometimes the faint howl of coyotes on the mesa, sometimes only the hollow ringing of one's own thoughts. Richard Langford had grown used to silence as his companion. He wore it like a second suit, tailored over decades of business and power. But on that night, after catching Emily Carter in the kitchen, sleep eluded him. In the master bedroom, the air conditioner hummed, the silk sheets cool against his skin. He lay awake, staring into the darkness. The sketches of lungs and arteries, drawn on scraps of grocery paper, had burned themselves into his vision. He saw the young woman's eyes, haunted, desperate, but also filled with knowledge he did not expect from someone her age, much less a maid. And with that vision came something unwelcome: memory. He was 20 years old again, back in Texas. His older brother Daniel, always the more athletic, had collapsed during a football game. Richard had rushed to the field, pushing past coaches and trainers. He remembered kneeling, pressing his ear to Daniel's chest, straining for a heartbeat that staggered like a drum missing half its rhythm. The doctors called it a congenital defect, a phrase that meant nothing to the family at the time, only that Daniel was gone by the next morning. He had been 26. Richard, just beginning his climb in real estate, carried the loss as fuel for ambition. But in the stillness of nights like this one, he could still hear it, the failing thud of his brother's heart against his ear, that sound of life unraveling. Now, decades later, the echo returned, summoned by the voice of a 19-year-old girl who spoke of pulmonary hypertension as though she had studied medicine in another life. The next evening, Richard found himself wandering into the kitchen again. Emily was there, this time scrubbing copper pans until her knuckles whitened. When she noticed him, she flinched, as though expecting reprimand. "I didn't touch your table again," she said quickly. Richard's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I'm not here to scold you. Sit." She blinked. "Sir?" "Sit," he repeated, motioning to the chair. Reluctantly, Emily obeyed, drying her hands on her apron. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard asked, "Tell me more about your brother." Emily's expression softened into worry, the lines of exhaustion carving deeper. "Jacob is 8. He used to run everywhere, like he was always chasing some invisible kite. Then he started slowing down. Last year he fainted in the schoolyard. The doctors finally diagnosed him. Pulmonary arterial hypertension. They said, it's progressive. Without treatment, it ends in right heart failure." Her voice faltered. She pressed her hands together tightly on the table. "Every night I hear it. His breathing. It's not just gasping. It's like his chest is trying to push against a wall that won't give. Sometimes he wakes up, blue around the lips. I grab the oxygen tank. I pray. I count the seconds until the color comes back." Richard listened, the words striking chords he had buried long ago. Emily continued, her tone steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I found videos, echocardiograms. I've watched them hundreds of times. I can trace the blood as it should move. The right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary artery. Blood flows to the lungs, exchanges carbon dioxide for oxygen. Simple, right? Except in Jacob's body, the pressure inside those arteries is so high, the blood can't move. His heart beats harder, faster, trying to break through. But that pressure..." She tapped the table, once, sharply. "That pressure is a wall, and one day, his heart will break against it." Her words hung heavy. The kitchen, usually a place of clattering pots and warm meals, felt like a lecture hall, yet more sacred. Richard leaned back, his chest tight. He remembered the sensation of Daniel's chest under his ear, the sluggish beat. The wall his brother's heart could not cross. "What do you hope to do?" he asked quietly. Emily looked up, her eyes fierce despite the dark circles beneath them. "Understand. Prepare. If I can see the signs before they happen, maybe I can save him. No one else will. Not the hospitals. They turned us away because my mother works minimum wage and we have no insurance. Not the charities. They all say waiting lists or paperwork. It's me. I have to be the one." Richard studied her. 19 years old, a maid scrubbing floors, yet carrying the weight of medical texts in her memory, anatomy sketched in pencil like scripture. "You know," he murmured, "most people your age spend their nights thinking of dances, or college parties, or lovers. Not right ventricles and pulmonary resistance. Emily's lips curved into a sad smile. I don't have the luxury. Jacob is my world. His heart, his failing heart, is my textbook, my alarm clock, my every thought. Her words pierced deeper than she knew. For Richard, who had built towers of glass and steel across New Mexico, who had conquered land and politics, there was something unsettling about this young woman's single-minded devotion. It reminded him of himself, but directed at life instead of empire. That night, after she retired to the small servant's room tucked behind the laundry hall, Richard poured himself a glass of scotch and sat by the wide kitchen window. He gazed out at the desert stars, the Milky Way spilling across the black sky. He remembered his brother's laughter, then his silence. He remembered his father's hollow rage at doctors who explained nothing. And in that silence, he understood something. Emily Carter was not speaking out of naive obsession. She was living with the sound of a failing heart each night. And perhaps, in listening to her, he was hearing his brother again. The next morning, Richard did something he had not done in years. He asked his driver to take him downtown, not to boardrooms or golf clubs, but to the University of New Mexico Medical Library in Albuquerque. He sat for hours, hidden behind newspapers and tinted glasses, leafing through medical journals. The terms swam before him: pulmonary vascular resistance, echocardiographic parameters, right atrial enlargement. They reminded him of the words Emily had spoken in the kitchen, words she had pieced together from scraps of the internet. She was right. It was a wall built inside a child's chest, growing thicker each day. Later that week, Richard returned from a trip to New York. Tired from meetings, he entered the estate near midnight. Again, light glowed from the kitchen. He paused in the hallway, listening. Emily's voice, soft, steady, reading into her phone. The tricuspid valve regurgitation velocity increases with pulmonary arterial hypertension. Jacob, if you feel dizzy, you have to sit right away, okay? There was a pause, then a child's faint voice on speaker. Okay, Em. I'll sit. I promise. Richard stood in the shadows, his throat tightening. For decades he had believed wealth insulated him from suffering. But here was suffering that no money could immediately fix, a sister teaching medicine to herself in the hope of saving a boy whose heart was failing beat by beat. And in that moment, Richard realized he was no longer a detached observer. Whether he liked it or not, the sound of that child's failing heart had entered his own. The Langford estate had rooms no one entered anymore. Whole wings of the mansion stood like abandoned cities, corridors stretching into silence. Down a narrow flight of stairs, past a locked wine cellar and a storage closet, there was an old basement once used for keeping seasonal furniture. Dust veiled the shelves, cobwebs clung to the corners. Emily Carter found it by accident when she was carrying linens. But when she pulled the chain and a single bulb flickered on, she saw something else. A classroom. Not in truth, of course, but in possibility. The walls were bare adobe, cool and lifeless, but to Emily's imagination, they became canvases. She pinned sheets of butcher paper scavenged from the kitchen and began to sketch. Lungs branching like winter trees, the great pump of the right ventricle, arrows showing the push of blood. Equations appeared too. Pulmonary arterial pressure equals mean pulmonary artery pressure, left atrial pressure, cardiac output. She copied them carefully from videos she had memorized, writing them over and over until her hands cramped. This was where she came after hours of polishing silver and folding sheets. It was here, hidden below the grand world of chandeliers and art galleries upstairs, that she created a secret school. One night, Richard Langford followed the faint sound of her voice. He had returned from an evening meeting, restless. The memory of his brother's death still clung like smoke. He was walking through the house when he heard murmurs beneath the floor. Emily's voice, calm but deliberate, rising and falling like a teacher at a lectern. Curiosity pulled him downward. He descended the narrow staircase slowly, his hand grazing the cold banister. At the bottom, he pushed open the basement door. What he saw stopped him. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her phone propped against a stack of old crates. On the screen, through a crackling connection, was Jacob. The boy's face was pale, framed in messy brown hair, an oxygen tube taped gently beneath his nose. His eyes, wide and trusting, followed his sister's every word. Behind Emily, the walls bloomed with diagrams. She had drawn an entire circulatory system across one wall, color-coded in red and blue, with arrows marking every chamber and vessel. Next to it, she had written phrases in careful block letters. Right ventricle overload, pulmonary resistance, oxygen exchange. Emily pointed with a ruler she had borrowed from the pantry drawer. So, Jacob, when the right side of your heart pushes blood into your lungs, it's like a pump sending water into a narrow hose. If the hose is too narrow, what happens? The boy coughed weakly. It gets stuck? Exactly. The pump has to work harder. That's why you get tired so fast. Jacob frowned. So my heart's working too hard? Yes. Her voice softened, but her eyes glistened. But that's why I'm learning. If I know how the pump works, maybe I can help it rest. Maybe one day doctors will let us in, and I'll know enough to keep you safe until then. Richard leaned against the doorframe, unseen, his chest tightening. When the call ended and Emily packed her notes, she turned and gasped. Sir, I didn't hear you come in. Richard's gaze moved over the wall of diagrams. You've made yourself a classroom. Emily bit her lip, embarrassed. I thought, no one comes down here. I didn't want to bother anyone. I just needed space. He walked slowly, examining her sketches. His fingers brushed a paper where she had drawn alveoli, tiny sacs like clusters of grapes, with oxygen molecules passing into capillaries. Do you even understand what you've written? He asked. Emily lifted her chin. Yes. The alveoli are where gas exchange happens. Blood comes in dark, without oxygen, and leaves bright red, full of it. Except with Jacob, the pressure in the arteries makes it harder to reach the alveoli in the first place. It's not the alveoli's fault, it's the arteries. Richard raised his eyebrows. And who taught you the term pulmonary vascular resistance? Her cheeks flushed. No one. I taught myself. I read textbooks online, the ones medical students upload. I don't understand all the math, but I try, because Jacob doesn't have time for me to wait until I can afford real school. There was defiance in her tone, as if daring him to laugh, but Richard did not laugh. Instead, he sat down heavily on an old wooden chair, his hand running over the rough diagrams. You remind me, he said after a pause, of my brother's doctors. Only difference is, you make more sense. Emily blinked, startled. Your brother? He died young, Richard murmured. Heart failure. They used words like pulmonary pressure back then, too. But they explained nothing. Only shrugged when we asked if he could be saved. A silence settled. The only sound was the faint buzz of the light bulb overhead. Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the ruler. I'm sorry, she whispered. Richard nodded slowly. So am I. In the days that followed, Richard found excuses to descend into the basement. He told himself it was curiosity, perhaps mild amusement, but truthfully it was something else, something he hadn't felt in years, the sense of learning, of being humbled. He would stand quietly as Emily spoke into her phone, explaining to Jacob the difference between systolic and diastolic pressures, or the role of the right atrium as a holding chamber. She used metaphors simple enough for a child. Blood was a river, the heart its dam, oxygen the sunlight it carried downstream. Yet beneath her simple words was real understanding. Richard, who had attended hundreds of conferences and paid for countless medical fundraisers, realized this maid could out-argue most physicians if only they would listen. One evening, after she finished a lesson, Richard stepped forward. "You know, Carter, you speak of the heart as though you've been inside one." Emily startled, but then smiled faintly. "In a way, I have. Every night, when I hold Jacob while he gasps for air, I feel his heart racing against my chest. It's like his little body is telling me its secrets." Richard looked at her for a long moment. He thought of his empire, buildings named after him, deals signed in his honor, and realized none of it had ever carried the raw clarity of that statement. The basement classroom grew. Emily found chalk and painted one wall black to use as a board. She taped printouts of X-rays, traced diagrams of right atrial enlargement, even copied down snippets of research papers she could barely afford to print at the library. And though he never admitted it aloud, Richard began listening, truly listening. One night, as she explained pulmonary hemodynamics over the phone, Richard sat in the shadows, his eyes closed. Emily's words became more than teaching. They were incantations against despair. She spoke of numbers and pressures, but what he heard was devotion. And in that devotion, Richard Langford, billionaire of stone and steel, felt something he had almost forgotten, the stirring of hope. New York glittered that night, its skyline like a crown of fire against the winter sky. Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm, limousines crowding Fifth Avenue, laughter spilling from Broadway theaters, and the endless heartbeat of commerce echoing through Wall Street. But for the wealthy and powerful, the true center of gravity was a grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. Richard Langford had attended more galas than he cared to count. For decades, these events had been the currency of influence: handshakes with senators, whispers with bankers, champagne toasts with fellow billionaires. Normally, he moved through them with the detachment of a man for whom nothing was new. But this evening was different. Emily Carter was here. She stood at the far end of the ballroom, half hidden behind the catering staff, wearing a crisp uniform borrowed from the hotel's service department. To everyone else, she was just another maid, carrying trays and clearing glasses. To Richard, she was the girl who had turned a basement into a classroom, who spoke of pulmonary pressures with the clarity of a scholar. He had not intended to bring her into his world. But when the gala was announced as a fundraiser for cardiac research, he had caught a look in her eyes, half hope, half hunger. She wanted to see what happened when the wealthy promised money for cures. And perhaps, secretly, Richard wanted her to see how shallow it all was. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light like frozen rain. Women in gowns swept across the marble floors. Men in tuxedos spoke of markets and mergers. A jazz quartet played near the dais where a senator would later speak. Emily moved silently, a tray in hand, her eyes wide. She had never stood in a room like this. Wealth pressed in from every side, gold leaf on the walls, perfumes so rich they mingled like competing symphonies. Yet beneath her awe was suspicion. How many of these people, she wondered, ever saw the inside of a hospital where children like Jacob waited for breath? Richard, across the room, caught her glance. He gave the faintest nod, reassuring her. She straightened her shoulders and continued working. The night wore on in speeches and donations, the usual ritual. A banker pledged $5 million to Harvard's cardiology department. A tech CEO announced a research grant for artificial heart valves. The crowd applauded politely, glasses clinked, the music swelled. Then, in an instant, the glitter fractured. At one of the front tables, a distinguished man in his 70s suddenly clutched his chest. His glass fell, shattering against the marble. His face drained of color as he collapsed backward, striking the floor with a thud that silenced the entire room. Gasps filled the air. Someone screamed. The music stopped. "Call 911!" a woman shrieked, fumbling with her phone. Guests surged around the man, but none dared touch him. His neck veins bulged, his skin clammy, lips tinged blue. His pulse raced erratically. The sight was one Emily knew all too well. She froze for only a second, then dropped her tray with a clang and pushed through the crowd. "Move!" she cried. "Please, let me through!" A security guard stepped in front of her. "Back, miss. We need a doctor." "There's no time!" Emily snapped, her voice sharper than she had ever dared. She knelt beside the fallen man, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. His pulse pounded rapid and weak. His jugular veins stood out like ropes, a sign she had memorized from textbooks. Right-sided heart failure. "Sir!" she shouted, tilting his head. His breaths came shallow, the rhythm of collapse. She turned to the stunned onlookers. "Elevate his legs, now! Get blood back to his heart!" No one moved. Richard's voice cut through the chaos. "Do as she says!" At once, 2 waiters lifted the man's legs onto a chair. Emily pressed her hand gently against his sternum, watching his color. "His right ventricle can't pump," she cried. "If we keep him flat, his brain won't get oxygen. Keep the legs up!" The crowd watched in frozen silence. The man gasped once, twice. Then his breathing steadied, color faintly returning to his cheeks. The pulse beneath Emily's fingers slowed, though still fragile. Sirens wailed outside. Moments later, paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside Emily. "What's his condition?" one asked briskly. "Acute right heart failure," Emily said without hesitation. "Jugular venous distension, hypotension, tachycardia. He responded to leg elevation." The paramedics exchanged quick glances. One nodded, impressed. "Good call." They lifted the man onto a stretcher, attaching monitors as they wheeled him away. The room exhaled as one. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the murmur began. First whispers, then shouts. "Who is she? Was that the maid? She knew what to do." Phones flashed. Guests filmed, snapping photos of Emily kneeling in her service uniform beside the chair where the man had nearly died. In the center of Manhattan's elite, the maid had become the savior. Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Stand," he said softly. She rose, trembling, the tray forgotten on the floor. The senator approached, his face pale. "Mr. Langford, who is this young woman?" Richard's voice carried through the ballroom. "This is Emily Carter. And you all owe her your gratitude." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rising in waves. Some clapped in genuine awe, others with the unease of those who had witnessed their own fragility exposed. Emily stood frozen, her cheeks burning. Later, as the guests resumed their chatter, the whispers turned sharp. "She could have killed him. She isn't licensed. What if she sued?" But others countered. "She saved his life. She saw what no one else did. She's extraordinary." By the end of the night, Emily's name was on every tongue. Reporters lingered by the entrance, eager for a glimpse of the maid who saved a millionaire. Richard guided her toward the limousine waiting outside. Inside, the hum of the city wrapped around them. Emily's hands shook in her lap. "I didn't think. I just acted." Richard studied her, his gray eyes unreadable. "That's what saves lives," acting when others freeze. You have a gift, Emily. Don't ever doubt it. Her eyes filled, though she blinked the tears away. But they'll come after me. You heard them. They'll say I practiced medicine without a license. Richard leaned back, his gaze fixed on the lights of Times Square passing by. Then let them come. They'll have to go through me first. That night, headlines were written before the ink of the day had dried. Maid saves millionaire at gala. Untrained but brilliant. Who is Emily Carter? Hero or liability? Maid's actions spark debate. Emily did not see them yet. She sat in the back of the limousine, her mind still on the man's pulse, the rise and fall of his chest as color returned. She had felt, for one brief moment, what it meant to hold a life in her hands and to give it back. For Richard Langford, the night confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This girl, with nothing but a pencil and fierce devotion, was not only fighting for her brother, she was changing the very world he thought he understood. And though neither of them knew it yet, the gala would mark the beginning of a storm that would test them both in ways no ballroom could contain. The headlines spread faster than the winter winds that howled across Manhattan. By dawn, Emily Carter's name was already viral. Every newspaper, every morning show, every blog carried the image of a young maid in a service uniform kneeling beside a collapsed man at the Plaza Hotel. Some called her a miracle worker. Others called her reckless. The maid who saved a millionaire, hero or hazard. The ethics of untrained rescue. She defied death. But did she break the law? In Albuquerque, Jacob watched the news from his mother's small apartment. His pale face broke into a grin, oxygen tubing curling at his cheeks. "That's my sister," he whispered proudly, his voice weak but full of awe. "That's Emily." But while the world marveled, a storm was brewing. The Langford estate became the epicenter of that storm. Reporters camped outside the iron gates, cameras flashing whenever a car approached. Calls flooded in from journalists, lawyers, even medical associations. Emily tried to stay hidden. She folded laundry, polished silver, anything to keep her hands busy while the walls of the house shook with voices she could not escape. On the television in the servants' quarters, experts debated her fate. She saved a man's life, yes, said one cardiologist, his tone begrudging. But what if she had been wrong? What if he had arrested? She could have caused irreversible harm. Another panelist countered. She recognized acute right heart failure and intervened correctly. Frankly, most bystanders would have frozen. "Intent does not excuse illegality," a lawyer snapped. "Practicing medicine without a license is a criminal offense. If the family chooses to sue..." Emily switched the television off, her hands trembling. She had not sought attention. She had only tried to help. But now the world was pulling her apart, one voice at a time. Richard Langford, however, faced the storm differently. He sat in his study, flanked by legal advisors. Their words clashed in the air like swords. "Mr. Langford, this could become a liability. If you continue to support her publicly, you risk entangling yourself in litigation." "She saved my guest's life," Richard said flatly. "Nonetheless," the lawyer pressed, "the family might argue negligence. If the gentleman had worsened..." Richard cut him off with a glare. "He didn't. Because of her." Silence followed. The billionaire's voice carried the weight of steel. For decades, men had trembled under it in boardrooms. Now it was turned toward defending a maid who had, against all odds, earned his respect. "Prepare a statement," he ordered. "The Langford estate stands behind Emily Carter. And if the American Medical Association has an issue, they can speak to me directly." When Emily heard of his words, she was stunned. She found him in the library, papers spread before him. "Sir," she whispered, hesitant, "you shouldn't." This could ruin you. Richard looked up, his gray eyes steady. I've been ruined before, Carter. Loss does that. Money only covers the scars. He gestured toward the newspaper clippings. This is not ruin. This is truth. Her throat tightened. But they'll come after me. They're already saying I'm dangerous. Richard leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. Let them. You acted when no one else did. You saved a man who would be in a coffin today if not for you. That is not danger, Emily. That is courage. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. For the first time since the gala, she felt her chest loosen. Yet the storm raged louder. By the end of the week, Emily's face appeared on talk shows. Some praised her as an inspiration, the maid who dared to learn. Others painted her as reckless, a symptom of a broken healthcare system. The American Medical Association released a cautious statement. While the intervention may have been life-saving, we do not condone unlicensed individuals performing medical acts. Such actions pose significant risks. Threats followed. Anonymous emails accused her of endangering lives, of pretending to be what she was not. Some messages promised lawsuits. One evening, Emily sat in the basement classroom, staring at her sketches. Her hands shook as she erased and redrew lines she already knew by heart. The walls seemed to close in, the diagrams mocking her. Was she a fraud after all? Her phone buzzed. Jacob's voice came weak but steady. Don't listen to them, Em. You knew what to do. You saved that man. You can save me too. Emily pressed the phone to her chest, tears spilling freely. Jacob's belief was the anchor she clung to as the storm threatened to drown her. Meanwhile, Richard fought back. He arranged interviews, speaking not as a billionaire but as a brother who had lost family to the silence of ignorance. I watched my brother die, he told one reporter. Doctors gave us jargon, not answers. Emily Carter gave answers. If she had been there that day, perhaps my brother would be alive. The clip went viral. For the first time, Richard's cold image cracked before the public. People began to see him not just as a tycoon, but as a grieving brother standing beside a young woman fighting for her sibling. The storm, once aimed solely at Emily, began to divide. Support grew online. Petitions appeared. Protect Emily Carter. Healthcare shouldn't be a crime. But backlash remained fierce. One morning, a letter arrived at the estate addressed to Emily. It was from the law firm representing the family of the man she had saved. Her hands shook as she opened it. We are reviewing possible charges of unlawful medical practice. Stand by for further notice. The words blurred. She sank to the floor, her breath shallow. Richard found her minutes later, clutching the letter. He knelt, his old knees creaking, and took it gently from her hands. They won't touch you, he said firmly. How can you know that? She whispered. Because I won't let them, he replied. His voice, gravelly and certain, carried not just the power of wealth, but the conviction of a man who had chosen his side. That night, Emily stood again in the basement classroom, staring at the diagrams. She touched the words she had written in block letters. Hope. For Jacob. For the man she had saved. For every child with a failing heart. The storm of voices outside could roar as loud as it wished. In this hidden room, she would keep learning, keep preparing, because knowledge, no matter how fragile, was the only weapon she had against the darkness. And now, she was not fighting alone. The snow had melted unevenly across the New Mexico desert, leaving patches of brown earth exposed under the pale winter sun. Albuquerque lay quiet that morning, its skyline small against the Sandia Mountains, a city where life could be both ordinary and cruel. Inside the University of New Mexico Hospital, the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic painted a world that Emily Carter knew too well. She stood at the nurse's station, her heart pounding, eyes fixed on the door to the pediatric ICU. Beyond it lay Jacob. Her brother had collapsed again that morning. His lips turned blue in the middle of breakfast, his tiny chest rising and falling with terrifying shallowness. Their mother had panicked, rushing him into the emergency room. By the time Emily arrived, Jacob had been placed on high-flow oxygen, his pulse weak, the monitor beside his bed flickering like a broken metronome. Emily pressed her palms against the counter. "Please," she begged the nurse. "He needs advanced treatment. Prostacyclin infusion. Anything to lower his pulmonary pressure." The nurse shook her head, her voice rehearsed with bureaucratic sorrow. "I'm sorry. Without insurance, we can stabilize him, but we can't initiate those therapies." Emily's throat tightened. "So you're telling me to watch him suffocate?" The nurse looked away. "There are protocols." Emily turned sharply, her fists clenched. Protocols. Always protocols. Walls built out of paper while children fought for air. Richard Langford had flown in that morning. The storm in New York still roared, but he had not hesitated when he heard Jacob was in crisis. His private jet touched down in Albuquerque, and his limousine brought him directly to the hospital. When he entered, the staff straightened instinctively. Even here his reputation preceded him, but he ignored their stares and moved quickly to Emily, who was pacing the corridor like a caged animal. "How is he?" Richard asked. Emily's face was pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. "They won't treat him. They say no insurance, no advanced therapy. They're letting him die, Mr. Langford." Her voice cracked on the last word, but anger burned behind it. Richard's jaw tightened. He turned toward the attending physician who had just emerged from the ICU. "You!" he barked. "What's the situation?" The doctor, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, adjusted his glasses nervously. "The boy is in right ventricular failure. His pulmonary pressures are dangerously high. We can provide oxygen, diuretics, but—" "But what?" Richard cut in. "We cannot administer advanced therapies without approval. These are expensive, high-risk treatments. The hospital policy requires either insurance or proof of coverage." Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Send me the bill." The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Langford, it's not that simple. We can't break protocol." Richard stepped closer, his voice steel. "My money built half the wing you're standing in. If you think protocol outweighs a child's life, then you have forgotten why medicine exists." The doctor faltered, but his eyes flicked toward Emily. "Even so, sir, the interventions are high risk. If the family were to sue—" "She won't," Richard snapped. "She's begging you to act." Emily's voice broke in. "Please, just give him a chance." But the doctor shook his head and retreated, muttering something about liability. Emily's knees buckled. She pressed her back against the wall, trembling. "They're going to let him die," she whispered. Richard's eyes softened briefly. Then he looked at her with the fierce gaze of a man unwilling to accept defeat. "Then we don't wait for them." Inside the ICU, Jacob lay small and frail against white sheets, his chest rising shallowly, oxygen tube hissing. His eyes fluttered open when Emily entered. "Em," he whispered, his voice barely a thread. "I'm here," she said, kneeling beside him. Her hands shook as she smoothed his hair. "I'm here, Jacob." The monitor beeped faster. Tachycardia. His right ventricle was failing under the weight of pressure. Emily felt panic claw at her throat. She remembered the videos, the lectures, the textbooks she had copied in her secret basement classroom. She had studied not just anatomy, but emergency maneuvers. One in particular surfaced now: prone positioning. If the patient lies face down, gravity can ease pulmonary pressures, redistributing blood flow, helping oxygen exchange. It was unconventional, but in desperation, it had saved lives. Emily looked at the nurse. "Help me turn him. Prone positioning." The nurse's eyes widened. "That's not approved protocol." "He's dying," Emily shouted. "Do it with me, or I'll do it alone." The nurse hesitated only a second before moving to Jacob's other side. Together, they gently rolled the boy onto his stomach, supporting his tubes. Almost instantly, the monitors shifted. Oxygen saturation climbed from 68% to 78%. His breathing, though still labored, grew steadier. Emily's tears spilled freely as she pressed her forehead to the back of his hand. "You're okay, Jacob," she whispered. "You're still here." Richard, standing at the foot of the bed, watched the numbers rise. For the first time in hours, relief softened his stern face. "You knew this would help," he murmured. Emily looked up, her cheeks wet. "I remembered from a lecture. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "You saved him." Again. Word of the maneuver spread quickly through the ward. Some staff whispered admiration. Others muttered about recklessness. Within an hour, the head of pediatrics arrived, demanding explanations. "This girl is not licensed," he thundered. "She cannot dictate treatment." Richard stepped forward, his height and authority filling the room. "She acted because your staff refused, and the result is clear. His oxygen levels are stabilizing. If you want to discipline someone, discipline me." "I ordered it," the doctor faltered, staring at him. Few dared challenge Richard Langford when his voice carried that note of finality. Emily kept her gaze on Jacob, who was breathing more evenly now. She did not care about arguments. All she cared about was the faint rise and fall of his back, the rhythm of hope. Hours passed. Jacob slept, still fragile but alive. Emily sat by his bed, her head resting on folded arms. Richard remained too, an imposing figure softened by the quiet hum of machines. At last, Emily whispered, "Why are you here, Mr. Langford? You don't owe me anything." Richard looked at her, his eyes shadowed with memories. "Because once, someone I loved lay in a bed like this, and I did nothing. This time I won't stand by." Emily swallowed hard. "Thank you." Silence settled between them, not empty but full of unspoken understanding. Outside the hospital, reporters had gathered. News vans lined the street. Cameras pointed toward the pediatric wing. Word had leaked. The maid who saved a man at the plaza had now saved her brother with an unapproved maneuver. Some headlines praised her as a genius. Others branded her dangerous. But inside that small ICU room, Emily Carter did not hear them. She held her brother's hand, feeling the faint warmth of life returning. Richard Langford stood beside her, a sentinel against the storm. For one fragile night, it was enough. The desert morning broke pale and cold, light spilling over the Sandia Mountains and filtering into the hospital room where Jacob slept. Machines hummed quietly at his bedside, steady but fragile, as if reminding everyone present how thin the thread of life could be. Emily sat slumped in a chair, her head resting against the mattress. She hadn't slept in 2 nights, but she refused to leave Jacob's side. Every rise and fall of his chest, every flicker of the monitor, she guarded like a sentry protecting a kingdom of breath. Richard Langford stood at the window, staring out over Albuquerque. The city stretched wide and low, adobe houses and strip malls scattered across desert plains. He looked older than his 62 years that morning, his shoulders bowed, his face drawn in deep lines. For all his billions, he seemed like a man stripped bare, carrying a weight that no empire could lift. When Emily stirred, blinking awake, she saw him watching the horizon. For a long moment she said nothing, then softly, "You haven't left either." Richard turned. His eyes, gray and heavy, met hers. "No." She straightened in the chair, stretching her sore back. "You don't have to stay, Mr. Langford. Jacob is my fight, not yours." Richard was silent, his gaze moving back to the horizon. "That's where you're wrong," he said finally. "It is my fight, too." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" He walked closer, pulling up the other chair. The motion seemed deliberate, as though he had been rehearsing this moment. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low, almost gravel. "Something I haven't told anyone outside a handful of doctors." Emily leaned forward, her stomach tightening. Richard Langford was a man wrapped in secrecy, his private life guarded like a vault. Whatever he was about to reveal felt heavier than any contract he had signed. He drew a breath, his jaw tightening. "I have pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. They discovered it 8 months ago. It has spread to my liver. The doctors say I have, perhaps a year, maybe less." Emily's eyes widened. The words struck like cold steel. For a moment, she could only stare at him, unable to speak. "I refuse treatment," Richard continued, his voice steady but hard. "Chemo, radiation, pointless. At best, it would give me a few extra months chained to a hospital bed. I've buried too many people to believe in miracles. So I decided I would not fight. I would let it come." The room fell silent except for the slow rhythm of Jacob's monitor. Emily pressed her hand against her mouth, her chest heavy with grief she had not expected to feel. She had imagined Richard as indestructible, untouchable in his wealth, his authority. But now he sat before her, a dying man. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Richard leaned back, his gaze locking with hers. "Because in you, I see the reason I should have fought. You fight for your brother, with nothing but scraps of paper and stubborn hope. I, with every resource at my disposal, chose surrender. Watching you has forced me to ask myself, what if there is still something worth fighting for?" Emily shook her head slowly, her throat tightening. "But you've already done so much. You built an empire. Why should you feel regret?" "Because," Richard said, his voice breaking, "I built walls, not bridges. Towers of glass, not moments of life. I thought success would protect me from loss. But when my brother died, when my wife left me, when my own body betrayed me, I realized I had built nothing that could keep me alive in the ways that matter." He looked toward Jacob, the boy sleeping with tubes in his nose. "And then I saw you. You remind me of everything I am not. Courage, sacrifice, purpose. You make me wonder if it is not too late." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She had expected arrogance, detachment, coldness from this man, but what she saw was brokenness laid bare, a confession carried like an open wound. "Mr. Langford," she began, but her voice failed. He raised a hand. "Richard. Call me Richard. Titles mean nothing now." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Richard, if you have even a chance, shouldn't you take it? Treatment may not cure you, but maybe it gives you time to build the bridges you say you never did." For a moment, Richard said nothing. His face tightened, as if fighting something inside. Then he whispered, "Perhaps." That afternoon, Emily stepped outside for air. The hospital courtyard was quiet, the desert sun warm on her shoulders. She thought about Richard's words, about his secret. She thought about Jacob, and how every minute of his life was a battle against the narrowing of his arteries. It struck her that 2 lives, one young, one old, were tethered by the same truth. Time was running out. When she returned to the ICU, Richard was sitting beside Jacob's bed. To her surprise, he was speaking softly to the boy, his voice gentle, almost paternal. "Your sister tells me you're braver than most men I know," Richard was saying. "You keep fighting even when it hurts. I wish I had half your courage." Jacob's eyelids fluttered. "Are you sick too, mister?" Richard's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to the boy. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I am." Jacob's lips curved faintly. "Then we both fight. Okay?" Richard blinked, his throat tight. He reached out, resting his large hand gently over the boy's. "Okay." Emily stood silently in the doorway, her chest aching with something that was both pain and hope. That evening, Emily and Richard sat together in the cafeteria. The hum of vending machines filled the silence between them. Finally, Emily spoke. "You said you refused treatment. Do you still believe that?" Richard stirred the untouched coffee before him. "I believed it until I saw him, your brother. Until I saw you. You fight for every breath as if it were gold. You made me realize. Maybe I've been a coward all along." Emily leaned forward, her eyes fierce despite exhaustion. "Then don't give up. Don't waste the time you still have. If you can't fight for yourself, fight for Jacob. Fight because he needs to believe people don't walk away." Her words landed like hammer blows, breaking through layers of resignation he had built around himself. Richard looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time in decades, he felt something new, the possibility of redemption. Late that night, as Jacob slept and the hospital grew quiet, Emily returned to the basement of her thoughts, her secret classroom. She pulled out the notebook she carried everywhere and wrote 3 words across the page. "Time is borrowed." She underlined it twice. Beside her, Richard's voice broke the silence. He had entered without her hearing. "Borrowed time," he echoed. "Yes. But maybe borrowed time is still time enough to change the ending." Emily closed her eyes, whispering, "Then, let's change it." Snow fell lightly in Boston, the flakes swirling like pale confetti over the Charles River. The city glowed with its winter lamps, a place where old brick buildings stood beside gleaming towers of medicine and research. It was here, Richard Langford announced, that something new would be born. Emily Carter sat stiffly in the back of the Blacktown car, Jacob's thin hand clasped in hers. He had been discharged from the Albuquerque hospital just days before, still frail, his oxygen tank nestled at his side like a constant companion. The boy's eyes, though tired, shone with wonder as he peered out the window. For him, Boston was another universe, tall, bustling, alive with possibility. Richard sat across from them, his expression unreadable. He had flown them on his private jet, arranged the hotel, and summoned reporters without fully explaining why. Emily's heart pounded with questions, but he offered no answers until they arrived. The car pulled to a stop in front of a historic building near Massachusetts General Hospital. A banner draped across its front read, "The Jacob Carter Foundation for Pulmonary Hypertension." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jacob blinked, his small face lighting up with astonishment. "Em," he whispered, tugging her sleeve. That's my name." Her throat tightened as tears stung her eyes. She turned to Richard, who was already stepping from the car, his cane clicking against the icy pavement. He looked older in the cold light, but there was fire in his gaze. "This," he announced as cameras flashed, "is not just a building. It is a promise. A foundation dedicated to research, treatment, and hope for every child like Jacob who is told their life is too expensive to save." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters leaned forward, microphones thrust out. Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering. Richard Langford, the man who had spent his life building empires of glass and steel, had now placed her brother's name at the heart of a new legacy. Inside the building, freshly painted walls gleamed. Offices waited for doctors and researchers. Rooms were set aside for patients who could not afford care. On one wall hung a plaque already engraved, founded in honor of Jacob Carter, whose breath reminds us every life is priceless. Emily traced the letters with her fingertips, her vision blurring. You did this, she whispered to Richard. No, he said firmly. You did. You fought for him when no one else would. I only provided the bricks. You provided the reason. She turned to him, her voice trembling. Why me? Why Jacob? You could have given your money anywhere. Richard's eyes softened. Because you made me remember why life matters. Because I watched a 19-year-old maid fight with more courage than any doctor I've ever met. And because I don't have much time left. I want what's left of me to matter. Emily pressed her hand to her lips, unable to stop the tears. Jacob leaned against her, whispering, We're going to help kids like me, Em. Lots of them. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Richard poured his resources into the foundation. He hired top researchers from Harvard Medical School, partnered with Massachusetts General, and pledged hundreds of millions for drug development. And at the center of it all, he placed Emily. One cold morning, he summoned her to the grand office overlooking the Charles. She stood nervously, still wearing the thrifted coat she had brought from New Mexico. You want me to work here? She asked, disbelief in her voice. Richard leaned back in the leather chair, his cane resting beside him. Not work. Led. This foundation exists because of you. I want you to guide its vision and... He paused, his gaze steady. I've spoken to the dean of Harvard Medical School. They're prepared to offer you a place. Emily's mouth fell open. Harvard? But I'm just a maid. I barely finished high school. I can't. Yes, you can, Richard interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. You've already taught yourself half the curriculum. You have the fire most students lack. You belong there. Emily shook her head, overwhelmed. But Jacob, he needs me. I can't abandon him for school. Richard leaned forward, his voice low, resolute. You're not abandoning him. You're bringing him with you. This foundation will cover his care, his treatment, everything. You're not leaving him behind. You're carrying him into the future. Her chest tightened. She thought of nights in the basement classroom, scribbling formulas under a single bulb, telling herself knowledge could save Jacob. And now, here was Richard Langford, offering her the very path she had dreamed of but never dared to believe was possible. Still, fear lingered. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Richard's expression hardened, his eyes flashing. Failure is not measured in grades or titles. Failure is refusing to try. And Emily Carter, you are not a failure. His words struck deep, searing into the place where self-doubt had long lived. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine it. A classroom at Harvard, white coat over her shoulders, Jacob sitting proudly in the front row of her life. But not everyone celebrated. Critics emerged quickly. She's unqualified, one headline sneered. A maid leading medical initiatives? Preposterous. Others accused Richard of reckless philanthropy, calling it a vanity project. Lawsuits threatened to resurface from those who still claimed Emily had endangered lives. Richard faced them all with his usual steel. Call it vanity if you like, he told one reporter. But if vanity saves children from suffocating, then let the world drown in it. Emily, meanwhile, focused on Jacob. She sat with him during treatments, reading aloud from the textbooks Richard bought her. "This," she explained softly one night, pointing to a diagram, "is the drug they'll give you soon. It opens your arteries, makes it easier for blood to flow." Jacob listened, his eyes wide. "So my heart won't have to fight so hard?" "Exactly," she whispered, kissing his forehead. It gets to rest. One evening, after a long day of meetings and lectures, Emily found Richard alone in his office. The city lights reflected against the glass, painting his face in gold and shadow. He looked weary, his hand pressed subtly against his abdomen. The illness, though unspoken, was never far. "Are you in pain?" Emily asked quietly. Richard forced a smile. "Some days are worse than others." She sat across from him, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you fight sooner? For yourself, I mean." He looked out the window, his reflection merging with the lights of Boston. "Because I didn't believe life had anything left to offer me. My empire was hollow, my house was empty. I thought dying quietly was easier than admitting I was already dead inside. Then I met you, and Jacob, and I realized I still have something to give." Emily's eyes glistened. "You gave us everything." He shook his head gently. "No. You gave me back the will to live, even if only for a little while." "That is more than everything." By spring, the Foundation's work had begun to ripple outward. Families from across the country wrote letters of gratitude. Mothers whose children had finally received treatment. Fathers who no longer had to choose between bankruptcy and their child's life. Emily read the letters aloud to Jacob in the evenings. His small chest swelled with pride. "They're breathing because of us," he whispered. "Because of you," Emily corrected, kissing his cheek. And in the quiet corners of her heart, she knew Richard's legacy was already alive. Not in the towers of real estate he had once built, but in the simple gift of air filling a child's lungs. New York wore black that day. The sky hung low, a heavy curtain of gray over the skyline, as if even the heavens mourned. The cathedral on Fifth Avenue was filled with silence broken only by the soft shuffle of footsteps and the muted weeping of strangers and friends alike. Richard Langford's casket rested at the front, draped not in opulent silk or corporate banners, but in a simple white cloth embroidered with a single symbol, a small, delicate pair of lungs stitched in blue thread. It had been Emily's idea, a tribute not to his empire of steel and glass, but to the cause that had become his final breath, the Jacob Carter Foundation. Emily sat in the first pew, Jacob beside her, his oxygen tank hissing softly at his side. The boy clutched her hand tightly, his face pale but determined. He had insisted on being here, despite the strain of travel. "He fought for me," Jacob had whispered. "I have to fight to say goodbye." As the service began, voices rose in eulogy. Senators praised Richard's philanthropy. CEOs spoke of his brilliance in real estate. Journalists remembered his iron will. But when Emily was called forward, the great cathedral fell into a deeper silence. She walked slowly to the podium, her black dress modest, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notes. She looked out over the sea of faces, men and women in suits worth more than her childhood home, reporters with cameras ready, strangers who had never known Richard beyond headlines. Her voice, when it came, was steady though soft. "You all knew Richard Langford as a billionaire, a builder, a man who commanded cities. But I knew him differently. I knew him as a man who came into a kitchen at 2 in the morning and asked why a maid was drawing lungs on scraps of paper. I knew him as the man who stood beside me when the world called me reckless. And I knew him as the man who, even in his final days, chose to give everything he had, not for another skyscraper, but for the breath of a child." Her eyes glistened as she glanced at Jacob, then back at the crowd. "He gave me the chance to dream." He gave Jacob the chance to live, and he gave hope to countless children whose names he will never know. That is Richard's true legacy, not the buildings you see in the skyline, but the lives that will keep breathing because he chose to fight. For a moment, the cathedral was utterly still. Then, slowly, people began to rise. One by one, they stood until the entire congregation was on its feet. A silent ovation for a man who had lived long in power but had found his soul in his final act of compassion. Emily stepped down from the podium, her heart heavy but full. She knew Richard would have scoffed at the praise, but she also knew he would have secretly been moved. That evening, the will was read. Emily sat with Jacob in the quiet office of Langford's attorneys, the city lights flickering beyond the window. The lawyer, a polished man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses and began. Mr. Langford's estate, valued at approximately $6 billion, has been left in entirety to the Jacob Carter Foundation for Pulmonary Hypertension. Emily's breath caught. She had expected generosity, but not this. Everything. The lawyer continued, in addition, personal bequests have been made. To Ms. Emily Carter, Richard leaves the contents of his private study, including medical texts, journals, and personal writings. To Jacob Carter, a scholarship trust, ensuring his education through medical school should he choose to pursue it. Jacob's eyes widened. He thought of me, he whispered. Emily pressed his hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. Of course he did. He always did. The lawyer cleared his throat, reading the final line. Tell them my wealth was borrowed, but my time with them was real. Signed, Richard Langford. Emily closed her eyes, the words searing into her heart. Borrowed wealth. Borrowed time. Yet what he had given them was priceless. In the weeks that followed, grief mingled with purpose. The foundation, now fully funded, expanded at a pace that astonished even seasoned philanthropists. Laboratories opened in Boston and New York. Pediatric clinics sprang up in Albuquerque and Dallas. Trials for new drugs began under grants carrying Jacob's name. Emily, though still reeling from loss, threw herself into the work. She met with researchers, families, doctors. She traveled to children's wards where mothers wept at her arrival, clutching letters of gratitude. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she returned to her apartment to find Jacob sitting at the kitchen table, poring over a stack of biology textbooks. His face was pale but intent, his pencil moving quickly across the page. "What are you doing?" she asked gently. He looked up, determination burning in his young eyes. "Studying. If Richard believed I could be a doctor one day, then I have to be." Emily's chest ached with pride. She kissed his forehead, whispering, "He would be so proud of you." But grief was never far. Emily often found herself returning to Richard's study in the Langford estate. She would sit in his leather chair, leafing through the journals he had left her. Some pages were filled with notes on real estate deals. Others, in his later handwriting, were raw reflections on mortality. One entry read, "I built towers to escape the silence, but in the end, it was a maid's voice that broke it. She reminded me that borrowed time is still time enough to leave something behind." Emily wept quietly over those words, pressing her hand to the page as though to hold his voice close. Months passed. Jacob began a new drug regimen funded by the foundation, and slowly, miraculously, his color improved. The shadows beneath his eyes faded, his laughter returned. For the first time in years, he could walk more than a block without collapsing. One spring afternoon, Emily wheeled him onto the lawn of the Boston headquarters, where children from across the country had gathered for treatment. Parents exchanged stories, doctors guided new therapies, and the air buzzed with the fragile music of hope. Jacob looked around, his small chest swelling with pride. "This is all because of him, isn't it?" Emily squeezed his hand. Because of him, and because of you. The boy smiled faintly. Then we're both living on borrowed time. Emily kissed his cheek, her heart breaking and healing at once. Yes, she whispered, but we're going to use every second of it. At the next board meeting, Emily stood at the head of the table. The trustees, seasoned professionals, looked to her with respect that still felt foreign to her 19-year-old self. She cleared her throat, holding Richard's cane in her hand as a quiet symbol of his presence. This foundation is not about charity, she said. It's about justice. It's about children who have been told their lives are too costly. It's about families who have been left behind by a system that values money more than breath. Richard gave us the means, but it's our duty to carry the mission forward. Every clinic we open, every life we touch is proof that borrowed time can still change the world. The board rose in unanimous applause. That night, as she walked home under the city lights, Emily paused on the bridge over the Charles. The water shimmered with reflections of Boston's skyline. She whispered into the cold air as though Richard could hear, "We're keeping your promise. Your borrowed time wasn't wasted." And in her heart, she felt the truth. His legacy was no longer measured in buildings, but in every child who would breathe easier because of him. The desert stretched wide and golden, the horizon shimmering under the New Mexico sun. Years had passed since the night Emily Carter first drew lungs on scraps of paper in a kitchen at 2 in the morning. Years since Richard Langford had walked into that room and, unknowingly, into the heart of her story. Now, at 30-year-old, Emily returned not as a maid, not as a frightened sister clutching medical textbooks, but as a doctor. The white coat hung lightly on her shoulders, embroidered with her name, Dr. Emily Carter, Pediatric Cardiology. Around her neck, a stethoscope gleamed. Beside her walked Jacob, no longer the frail child tethered to an oxygen tank, but a tall, broad-shouldered young man of 18. His color was healthy now, his breath strong. On his chest hung a student's badge from Harvard College, where he had just begun his pre-medical studies. He carried his own white coat draped over his arm, his face shining with the promise of the future. Before them stood a small building newly constructed on the outskirts of Albuquerque. Its adobe walls blended into the desert landscape, humble yet solid, with a sign above the entrance that read, "The Jacob Carter Free Clinic for Children." Emily stopped, her throat tightening. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at the building. This was the place she had once dreamed of in whispers, the impossible dream of a clinic where no child would be turned away for lack of insurance, where protocols would never silence compassion. And now it stood before her, sunlight glowing on its walls, a miracle made real. Inside, the clinic bustled with quiet purpose. Nurses moved gently from room to room, guiding families who had traveled from dusty villages and small towns. The waiting area was filled with children, brown-eyed, bright-eyed, some with oxygen tubing, others with wheelchairs, many holding their mothers' hands. On the walls hung bright murals of desert flowers and flowing rivers, painted by local artists to remind children that healing could be beautiful. Emily walked the halls slowly, taking it all in. Every room smelled faintly of new paint and hope. Medical equipment gleamed, donated by hospitals and funded by the foundation Richard had left behind. She paused at the central plaque mounted by the entrance, dedicated to the memory of Richard Langford, who taught us that borrowed time can still change the world. Emily pressed her fingers to the words. Her heart ached with gratitude. "We did it, Richard," she whispered. "We kept the promise." On the opening day, families gathered outside, the desert sun high and merciless. Emily stepped onto the small podium erected before the clinic, her white coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. Jacob stood proudly beside her, his youthful face radiating strength. Her voice carried across the crowd. When I was 19, my brother Jacob was dying. The hospitals turned us away because we had no insurance. But in the darkest nights, I studied by myself. I believed knowledge could save him. And then, a man who carried his own wounds chose to believe in us. He gave us hope. Today, this clinic is not just about medicine. It is about justice. No child here will ever be told their life is too costly. No mother will ever again have to beg for air for her child. Here, every breath matters. Applause rose, mingled with tears. Parents held their children close, some crying openly, others whispering prayers of thanks. Jacob stepped forward, his voice clear and youthful. When I was 8, I thought I wouldn't live to see tomorrow. Now I'm alive because people refused to give up on me. I promise you, I will become a doctor, and I will spend my life making sure every child here gets the same chance I did. The crowd erupted again, hope flooding the desert air. That afternoon, the first patient arrived. A little girl no older than 6, her dark hair braided, her dress faded from wear. She clung to her mother's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Her lips were tinged with blue, and her breaths came shallow, each one a small battle. Emily knelt to meet her gaze, her stethoscope glinting in the sunlight. "Hi, sweetheart, I'm Dr. Carter. What's your name?" The girl whispered, "Sophia." Emily smiled softly. "Sophia, I'm going to help you. Your heart and lungs, they're like a river. Sometimes the river gets blocked, and the water can't flow. But don't worry, we're going to make the river run free again." Sophia's small eyes flickered with hope. For the first time, she let go of her mother's hand and reached for Emily's. As Emily guided her inside, she felt Jacob watching. She turned back, and for a moment the two siblings shared a glance heavy with memory. Nights of fear, of prayers whispered over failing breaths, of borrowed time turned into a second chance. Later, as the desert sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and rose, Emily stood alone outside the clinic. She looked toward the mountains, their peaks glowing red. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant echo of coyotes. She closed her eyes and spoke softly, as though Richard were standing beside her. "You once told me wealth was borrowed, but time with us was real. Well, Richard, your borrowed time gave us this. You're here in every child who breathes, in every parent who doesn't have to beg, in every doctor who chooses compassion over protocol. Your time wasn't wasted. It was transformed." Tears slid down her cheeks, but they were not bitter. They were the tears of healing, of gratitude, of love. That night, Emily and Jacob sat together on the clinic's rooftop. The stars blazed fiercely in the desert sky, a canvas of eternity stretching above them. Jacob leaned back, breathing deeply, the sound strong and even. "Do you remember," Emily whispered, "when I used to hold you in the night, listening to your heart race like it was trying to break free?" Jacob smiled faintly. "I remember. I also remember you never let go." She rested her head against his shoulder. "And I never will." For a long time they sat in silence, the desert wrapping around them like a blanket. The clinic below glowed softly, its windows shining with life. Inside, children slept under care they once would have been denied. And above them, the stars burned on, reminding them that even borrowed time could light the universe. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this healing story. Every breath, every smile, and every tear reminds us that love and hope can create miracles. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so we can continue sharing more warm and healing journeys together. See you in the next story.